everyone. Hello. Welcome to what I am confident and hopeful will be an interesting and illuminating discussion on a question that intrigues and confounds and actually sometimes even motivates philanthropists. Should philanthropies be permanent? I'm Jack Fowler, the director of the Center for Civil Society at American Philanthropic and the author of its new weekly email newsletter, Civil Thoughts. My dear friend and colleague, Maria, who is helping to run the show here behind the scenes. She's going to put up some links to these and other things in the chat, so you'll be able to find how to access those things. At the Center for Civil Society, we're determined to provide a forum through webinars, through conferences, one of which we're having in Scottsdale in November, to be a convening entity to consider matters that matter to doers, givers, and thinkers. And today's discussion lands a little bit in the basket of givers, who are also happen to be doers and thinkers, while the question of sunsetting foundations is open to consideration by people of all charitable intent, regardless of political or philosophical belief. The issue of foundation permanence is one, I think it's fair to say, of particular and ongoing concern to many conservatives. Conservatives look to recent history of wealth, often created by free market capitalists and social conservatives either, who endow their philanthropies, create and endow them with their funds, hoping to carry out the same themes that which they led their lives. And then, but they in turn, they find that their bounty can be spent on causes antithetical to the beliefs of the donor, the founding donor. So we're going to discuss this milieu, how true it is, and the reactions to it. And we're going to particularly discuss is sunsetting maybe a prescriptive means against seeing, well, we'll call it conservative wealth to underwrite future leftism. Again, to be clear, though, it's not always left or right dynamics here. So who's going to be educating us today, sharing their wisdom and perspective? We have fortunate to have this dynamic trio, three people I'm blessed to know and more so respect. And I do want to be clear that life's about opportunity cost, and they agreed to spend an hour of their time with us today. So I'm very appreciative of that. Ladies first, Heather, okay. Heather Richardson Higgins is the president and CEO of the Randolph Foundation. Her background is in finance, public policy, and media. She runs the Randolph Foundation, which for 20 years has done venture philanthropy. She's been on the board of the Hoover Institution, the Philanthropy Roundtable, was a co-founder of the Alliance for Charitable Reform. Heather's very well known for her role in the Independent Women's Voice, Independent Women's Forum. She writes frequently. She's an expert on healthcare strategy, amongst many other things. So and Heather has written a very profound piece from years ago in her, well, just from years ago, and still remains a very important scholarly piece on this very question. Dick Devos is here with us. Thanks, Dick. Dick is an quite an accomplished executive. He's on the board, served at Amway, the Wingquest Group. Dick, did you run the Orlando Magic, or were you just
ran it for a while? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was most fun. That was actually the most fun job I've ever had.
Okay, that's pretty unique. Dick's philanthropy, the Dick and Betsy DeVos Family Foundation, has granted over at least $200 million since it was founded about, I think, roughly 30 years ago. A lot of it to many causes, particularly religion. Western Michigan has been a great beneficiary. And Dick has many other causes, including love of things flying. And John Miller, our third participant today, John's an old friend, great friend. He's the director of the Dow Journalism program at Hillsdale College. He writes for National Review, Wall Street Journal. He's written a number of books. One of them was The Big Scrum, How Teddy Roosevelt Saved Football. But another book he wrote, which is going to be used today I hope this doesn't come up backwards, is A Gift of Freedom, How the John M. Olin Foundation Changed America. John is considered, he might not consider it, but many consider John an important voice or someone with great knowledge of this issue of permanence. One other thing, John is a member of a foundation, the Apgar Foundation, which is actually going through sunsetting. So we're going to talk to John about how that is, what's it like to be involved with a foundation that actually does sunset. So those are our participants. I'd like to get this started. Dick, if you don't mind, with you. And I'm reading, I have notes on the wall in front of me that I never forget. So we're not going to start with you, Dick. We're actually going to start with your mother and father, if you don't mind. They were.
That's where a lot of it started in our family.
Well, that's why I didn't think you'd disagree with me. Your mom and dad, God rest their souls, they had a very important foundation, very generous over the years. It still exists, but maybe exists only technically. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about, you must have discussed this with them. They must have discussed this with you, the question of sunsetting. Why did Richard and Helen Devos Foundation have a termination date to it?
Well, first of all, Jack, thanks for doing this and for hosting an important conversation on an important subject. Donors are thinking about these sorts of things in new ways. And my parents did, in fact, sunset their foundation. But I would just want to step back a little bit to a moment to see how they thought about this. Fundamentally, they did not fund the foundation massively so that it could go on into perpetuity. They funded it sort of as they went to some extent, and then toward the end, they tried to match their funding to their contributions. They also encouraged their children, us. Now, as I'm approaching my 66th birthday, it's hard to refer to myself as a child. Nonetheless, we have had my wife Betsy and I have had our own foundation, and we're encouraged by my parents from the earliest days, not only to give generously, but to establish a foundation and a process to do that. And so rather than them forcing our family into a conversation across the family and feeling as though the family's decisions would be contributing decisions, they said, you should be making the decisions. You should be you should be both contributing your funds, your personal money, but you should be making those decisions. And that's worked out extremely well. So today, myself, my siblings all work well together. We share staff for our various foundations, and we now have numerous foundations operated by different family members, sharing staff and resources so it becomes very efficient. My parents also did a great gift to us with sunsetting to the extent that they were very articulate about it. They laid out, they began toward the end of their lives. Lord bless them with long lives, but also with without accident. They died natural causes over time at ages 90 and 92, and so they were able to plan ahead, and they were very clear with their family how they wanted things to be sunset, where they wanted the funds to be distributed to, and that was a real gift to us. To be able to execute their wishes over a period of time. And we are still executing that and will be for the next few years.
So Dick, as now applying to I mean, you could speak for yourself and Betsy and your foundation. Let me ask you, why do you call it the Dick and Betsy DeVos Family Foundation? Is there any reason for that? I'm not trying to imply this anything.
No, we actually, because we, and that change was frankly in response to Betsy's interim service to our country when she went to the Department of Education. And at that point, we did, because she had to exclude herself from foundation decisions, we did involve our children, our adult children, in the conversation about giving, so that it was not myself, but it was a family effort. But each of our children have their own foundations as well. And Betsy and I still, now that she's returned to private citizenship, are making are taking the leadership of our foundation and encouraging them to lead in theirs.
One more question to you, Dick, before we go on to John and Heather. Amongst the family, are there discussions about sunsetting? Are there gatherings where we discuss the philosophy of philanthropy? What's the Devos broader diaspora dynamic when it comes to this?
Yeah, we do. We've talked about it. Our parents talked about it openly. We've talked about it. We've established that principle in our planning documents, and I'm virtually certain that all of my siblings, my generation, have done the same. And oftentimes, in our case, if there are funds remaining in the foundation, we've come to the conclusion that there are probably 3 different places that you can trust. In our case, as is the case with my parents, decided to trust our family or our children to disperse funds. You can either give them to the government in the form of taxes, estate taxes. You can give them to a charity that may or may not, or a foundation that may or may not hold true, or you can tip over and distribute them amongst your children for them to carry on and make wise decisions. In our case, that's the direction that we're going. If there are funds remaining in our foundation after a period of years, it tips over to our kids.
Okay. John Miller, old friend. I'm holding here, this is a replica of the first issue of National Review. And the reason I have it here is because it's interesting. On the back of the first issue, there were greetings. This is from 1955. Cecil B. DeMille, Ludwig von Mises, but an important name is on here, I think important to the subject matter today, and it's J. Howard Pugh, who wrote, "It is most heartening to learn that a true conservative weekly of opinion is to be published. Our country desperately needs such a paper. My congratulations." J. Howard Pugh was one of the Pews, I think there were 4 of them, whose funds and legacy comprised the Pew Trusts, and is an arguing point for many conservatives of conservative money that has gone left or gone liberal. So John, folks, you should look up John's writing history. He likes lists. He likes greatest hits, or the 100 best conservative books and 100 best albums, those sorts of things. They're always intriguing writing. But John, give us the top hits of the Pew types in recent American history who were conservative people who became philanthropists who would not recognize today where their money is going.
Well, the Pew example is a great one. I haven't seen a Pew ad in National Review in a few weeks, Jack. Right. So there's one example for you. The biggest example, though, the one that people turn to and that influenced John M. Olin, the philanthropist on whom I wrote that book and I know the most about, is the example of the Ford Foundation, which was started, of course, by the auto magnate in Detroit and drifted over a number of years to the point where in the 60s and 70s, this organization, which was a creature of the free market, its wealth came from American capitalism and American capitalists. By the 60s and 70s, it had drifted to the left and was embracing government programs, economic programs that were anathema to the original vision of Henry Ford, to the point where his namesake quit the board of the Ford Foundation. I think this was in 1977, and he says this is no longer a foundation who's giving the creator of this wealth would recognize. In fact, it's even opposed to a lot of what he stood for. It's fighting against the sorts of things that made its own creation possible. And so he publicly resigned from the board. He issued a letter that was given to the press saying why he was doing it. and of course was roundly condemned by people who thought, why on earth should a philanthropy support the free market and the American capitalist system? But that's the very best example, is the Ford Foundation, still one of the largest foundations in America, turning away from some of the original principles of its donor and opening the eyes, I think, of a lot of American philanthropists about the dangers of perpetuity and the idea that an organization over time can drift from its original mission, even to the point where it opposes some of the things that made its creation possible.
John, tell us how that, which you've written about in your book, but this, you wrote this, shook Olin's faith in philanthropy, the Ford, what Henry Ford II did. Maybe talk a little about John M. Olin briefly. Was he even thinking about matters of perpetuity before this, or was this his great awakening?
John M. Olin was an American industrialist. He was his company made chemicals, munitions. It had a lot of interests, and he set up a foundation in the 1950s, and the question of perpetuity was not on his mind. He set up a foundation for the reasons a lot of rich people do, but as a kind of tax vehicle and so forth. But he did want to. He knew he would be in a position to give away a lot of money, and he created the vehicle for doing that. And he was starting to give away through this foundation amounts every year, not enormous amounts. And he was still, he was running his company. He was a businessman that occupied him almost fully, although they would have, their annual meetings and they'd give away some gifts and so forth. By the late 60s and early 70s, he knew he needed to turn his attention a little more aggressively toward this foundation and what his legacy would be. He knew he'd have a lot of money to put in there and to give away. And the question was, what does he want to do with it? And he decided that he wanted to have a foundation that would, in his words, and this is a close paraphrase, that would support the economic system that made this wealth accumulation possible in the first place. In other words, support free market ideas through think tanks at universities, advocacy organizations, and that sort of thing. And so he had a kind of particular form of philanthropy he wanted to engage in. And at the same time, he was thinking about this is going to last beyond my own life. He knew his own time was coming. He knew the actuarial realities of what was coming, and knew that his foundation would outlive him. He was aware of the problem of a political drift of the sort that the Ford Foundation suffered, but the actual event of a Ford resigning from the Ford Foundation board, he's the last family member on the board, he quit in frustration. John M. Olin recognized the problem, and so he essentially commanded the board members of his foundation to spend out the foundation within the lifetime of the youngest member. And what that meant practically was the foundation would live for about a generation beyond the death of John M. Olin. He curiously never put this in writing, which
I want to talk about, John, I want to talk about that a little later because I think it's interesting.
Oh, okay, so we'll get to that a little bit later. But the idea was a generation after I'm gone, my foundation will be gone as well, and that's essentially what happened.
Heather, I'm gonna ask. I'm getting you in here in one minute. But John, two apostles of, Heather wasn't the apostle, the first apostle of against perpetuity. Actually, Benjamin Franklin was, although there was a long shelf life on his foundation. But there's a famous, and I don't think well enough known, philanthropist early in the 20th century, Julius Rosenwald, who was a great philanthropist, and B, an adamant advocate of sunsetting. I don't know that they would call it sunsetting at the time, but would you give us a brief, just a brief rundown of Rosenwald, and then I want to bring Heather in on something.
So Julius Rosenwald, before he was a philanthropist, he was a businessman. If you've ever heard of Sears, the department store company, the reason why you've heard of it is because of this guy. It was his business genius that made Sears such a successful company for so long. And when it came time for him to become a philanthropist, after he had amassed his own fortune, he wanted to help African-American education, particularly in the South. He wanted to improve the economic opportunities for his fellow Americans, Black Americans. And this is what he wanted to do. But in setting up his own foundation, he said, it's not going to exist forever. And so he set an expiration date on his foundation. He wrote about this publicly. He had a couple of articles in the Atlantic Monthly, and this is in the 1920s and 1930s, explaining his ideas and why he's doing it. And basically saying it doesn't make sense for this thing to live on forever. It should have an impact on its own time. And so I've set this foundation up this way. This was very much a minority view for a lot of years. And I would say until fairly recently, the idea of sunsetting seemed odd and unconventional. And I think it's become quite familiar to a lot of philanthropists, especially the ones who are politically right of center. But he was a real pioneer in this regard.
Well, and one of the reasons that's become a more popular position is because of Heather Higgins. Heather, a little later on, I'm going to ask you to talk about the foundation itself, but I'd like you to react to this, something, it's in John's book, and it jumps off of Rosenwald. It's something that Daniel Boorstin, the great American historian, wrote about foundations and their size. And he wrote, "The public dangers which arise from them," large foundations, "come precisely from the fact that there is no prospect that they will ever become obsolete. Spontaneity, drift, fluidity, and competition among American institutions have given our culture much of its vitality. Some of the dangers which come from the new large foundations spring from the very vagueness and generality of their purpose, as well as from their sheer size. They show few signs of self-liquidating, of that self-liquidating tendency that Rosenwald rightly insisted to be a feature of a healthy foundation." So Heather, after this, we're going to get into the famous essay you wrote. But right here, the point Boorstin is, I think, making is the lack of sunsetting, and mixed with the mass of largesse at some of these foundations, is almost un-American. Is that a right way to in part look at this?
It was certainly contrary to common law. I think laws are a lot like morality, which is that there are aspects of them that are designed to govern us, but there are others that are designed so that the larger culture survives and has a better chance of surviving well. And the common law restrictions that you saw on perpetuity, when Franklin set up his foundation for 200 years, it had a very defined purpose. So you were allowed to create long-lived charitable entities, but they had to have very defined purposes. What was new in, I think it was 1913, with the Rockefeller Foundation, was this abstract idea of perpetuity with just good intentions, but no really clear, specific purpose or accountability. And that has become a problem. It's going to become a greater problem, and it's a problem for many reasons, having to do with the incentives largely that come with a perpetual institution, the distance from the donor and the original intent, the intentions and incentives for the staff, the totally different world understanding, which I think is not so much left-right, but do you live in a zero-sum world where you just have a fixed or growing pot of money that you get to give away, as opposed to somebody who comes out of the world that understands that it's not just a zero-sum game of free distribution. And those things tend to influence the philosophy as well as the foibles of human nature. And you just watch it happen over and over and over again.
Heather, I'm going to read the conclusion of an essay written by Mike Joyce, the late Mike Joyce, who ran the Bradley Foundation. And as many people know, and if you don't know it, now you know it, and there'll be a link in the chat. I think it was 1996, the Philanthropy Roundtable asked Heather and Mike Joyce to have a yes-no essay debate. It really wasn't a debate, but
first we had a debate, and he needed 3 drinks in order to debate me on this subject.
Oh, wow. I'd love to see, if there's a video of that, I'd love to see
I
it.
don't
but,
think they videotaped it.
You wrote the case for limiting the lives of foundations, and Mike was the case for perpetuity. And this is how it ended. I just want to, Mike's gone to his eternal reward, God rest his soul, but here's what he wrote. Because I do not believe that history is the unfolding of Marx's mind, because I do not believe there is anything in the nature of foundations that requires them to be malevolent institutions, because I believe that institutions can be so structured, staffed, and led as to maintain their integrity or to regain it if it falters, and because I expect great and good works from the foundations of the past, present, and future, I believe that sunset laws for foundations may be the worst of mistakes, both faithless and perpetual. Now, I might ask you to comment on that, but that is at one time if you would call it, conservative case for perpetuity. Earlier in his essay, and I think that's the limit of my reading aloud today, I think Mike hits on a theme that says sunsetting is almost a sign of despair of the future. He mentioned Marx. He claims that conservatives who are in favor of sunsetting have accepted the notion that Marx, history was won by Marx, right? And we are the losers, so we might as well accept that reality. So that's a crude, maybe cartoonish way of stating it. But Heather, I have two things to ask you here. One is if you want to comment on it, please do. But more broadly, the essay that you wrote, if I asked the question, what hell hath perpetuity wrought? Maybe you could answer that in
Sure. Well, Mike has now truly discovered what perpetuity is, the one true perpetuity for all of us.
right.
And I think part of the reason that I think the consensus was that I won that debate, even though people didn't want me to, was that his arguments are a bunch of either straw man arguments, wild exaggerations, or wishful thinking. And they don't address any of the arguments that I raise for the realities of human nature. And particularly if you're a conservative, and as Jonathan Haidt, that time self-describing as a liberal Democrat, realized in chapters 11 and 12 of The Righteous Mind, he had this epiphany, was that the reason that the left tends to have these wonderful utopian policies that don't work, and conservatives actually accurately predict what outcomes will be, is that we have a better understanding of human nature and what the incentives are that lead to secondary and tertiary consequences, despite the best of intentions. And so I would encourage anybody who's listening to this because we're doing this, I went back and read now, 25 years later, that essay, and it's not only held up, it's actually kind of borne out. Right. And at the time I wrote it, I was feeling very alone, not that ever bothers me, but at the time, everybody thought I was goofy. And now I think a lot of people are seeing that not only the incentives within different foundations have played out in this way over and over again, but the public policy implications for the charitable sector are playing out as predicted, with an increasing claim, for example, that private money is actually public money, and the government ought to be able to tell you how and where to spend it and what it should be spent on, et cetera. So that conflation of what is public and what is private, and that is, again, human nature. If that pot gets big enough, then it's going to become a very desirable target for people who want to get their mitts on it. And that's the reality of life. And that was what we were looking at, because Howard Hesek had this marvelous piece recently talking about.
We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Yeah.
So payouts are not keeping up with growth. It's
right.
just mushrooming, and the incentives of boards are that. And I remember when I was involved in litigation and I was capped by the court on how much I could pay out, because I'd been paying out more than 5% a year. I went to the IRS and I said, can I not count all of my administrative expenses towards my qualifying distribution because I've got all these obligations to little grantees who are desperately needing our funds. And if I'm constrained, they're the ones who are going to be hurt. And the IRS came back to us and said, in all the years we've been doing this, this is the agent saying, in the 15 years he'd been doing it, never once had anyone ever inquired if they could not count the qualifying distribution and other administrative expenses. So the incentive always seems to be to spend out as little bit as you can, not to do the charity now. That I'm saying always. I'm sure there are marvelous foundations that are spending out more than the qualifying distribution. The Gates Foundation is one of them, for example. And maybe there are some that are not limited live foundations that are also spending out more because they see a real need. But the incentive structure there overall is going to push in the other direction.
I want to get into, I'm going to address the Husak article to Dick, because Dick was kind enough to bring it to my attention. But before I do that, I'm going to wrap a question we have from one of the folks watching. But Heather, before we go to Dick on this, there is a sense of hubris in perpetuity, isn't there?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, why should you, existing at this point in time, presume that you're going to have the wisdom to know what is best for 100 years, or never mind 100 years, 200 years from now? That's just extraordinary. And if you listen in any family, the grandchildren will be saying, well, Grandpa would have agreed with me if he'd only lived now and seen the reality of our situation. The incentives to redefine donor intent and to justify those redefinitions are very great. But mostly it's, we don't want to think ill of our kids, and people they see this as a way to give them a gift and to keep the assets in the family, but yeah, it's not really what it's for.
Yeah, I'm going to raise this Howard Husak piece, but it's funny, Dick, you said before, but a child, not a child. I think that word is so loaded. Oh, my children, like they're still children, even though they're 66 years old or whatever. That it sort of feeds into the want to control into the future, because I can't leave it in the hands of kids. That said, I lied. I am going to read something. So Howard Husak last week was a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He wrote a piece and his analysis of the major foundations in America right now, showing their payout ratios, which are typically around 5%, except, as you mentioned, Heather, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There's also the Walton Family Foundation, which, according to the most recent figures, gives out 12%. But the line is the floor has become the floor has become the ceiling. So the minimum was to be 5%, but many foundations have taken that as much as they're going to spend. So they're paying out 5% a year, but Husak also provides the information of their returns on investment. So Dick, I'd like you to address this. I mean, you know all about investment, Dick, I know that, but here we have, for example.
Oh, I do. I've made good ones and I've made bad ones. I know a lot about it.
Yeah, but I think I'll trust you in the aggregate. We'll take the Macarthur Foundation, which, is of course is one of the foundations, which was John Macarthur was a conservative, and of course they've gone quite left. But the payout ratio is 5.6%, 5.8% investment return. Some of here are much more significant. The Packard Foundation is 5.9 versus 7.4% growth a year. What we see in all these major foundations, none of them have a corpus that is declining, except maybe Gates will, or he has a sunset on it. But we are seeing, yes or no, Dick, we're seeing perpetuity in action, but just by this continued growth of the endowments of these foundations.
I think there's any question. And I think, Heather made a couple of good observations that I would agree with. One, I've known this. I mean, look, my history is growing up in the Amway business and ultimately running that company. And Amway was all about incentives. I happen to believe incentives matter, and what you incentivize drives human behavior. And if you incentivize perpetuity, if you incentivize self-preservation, you'll get self-preservation. If you incentivize solving a problem, then maybe a problem gets solved. But unfortunately, the incentive structures are oftentimes wrong. I'd also note that the world, the pace of change in the world is so dynamic now that I think contemporary donors do need, and hubris is a good word that Heather used, that contemporary donors really need to appreciate that the issues of today are not going to be quite as linear tomorrow as they used to be. It used to be that the pace of change was less, and you could assume what the issues of tomorrow were going to be and how to address them. Not quite the case today. And so you're kind of stuck as a donor. Are you going to narrowcast your foundation's vision and risk becoming irrelevant, or are you going to broadcast and risk becoming overtaken by perverse incentives?
Now, to my friends here, the issue of perpetuity has not just come about for this webinar discussion today because we were, searching around for what can we have a webinar about. It's actually a matter now under public consideration. The issue's been raised in Congress, maybe in a backwards way. Many folks know that Senator Grassley and from Iowa, Republican of Iowa, in conjunction with Senator Angus King from Maine, have proposed this Accelerating Charitable Efforts Act. And Craig has asked a question. I'll read the question here, and then I want to bring out something from Husak's article. Craig asks, what do the panelists think of the proposed accelerating charitable efforts that, among other things, puts a time restriction on donor-advised funds? Is this time restriction a good idea for the increasing popular giving vehicle? Now, before Heather and Dick, if you take that question on, John, I'm going to get to you after that about your own experience with the Sunsetting Foundation. The fact, some of the other data that Howard Husak has made available in his article shows that, first of all, this law wants to shut down donor-advised funds after 15 years. As it relates to existing philanthropies, maybe increase the 5% to 7%, but nothing about sunsetting for philanthropies. Sunsetting for donor-advised funds, but donor-advised funds by record here have a roughly 16, 20, 24% annual giving. I mean, they're just beating the pants off of regular foundations when it comes to annual giving, but they're a target. So anyway, that's the question posed here and by Craig. What do you think about the capping of donor-advised funds? Let's start with Dick, since you brought this article to my attention.
Yeah. Well, I happen to believe in freedom, so I'm always as soon as there's governmental attachment toward an idea that would limit my freedom as a donor, left, right, or center, I'm a little bit concerned about it. And as you say, the donor-advised funds are now under attack. Unfortunately, I would argue,
yeah.
And so I would tend to be very, very reticent on something of that sort. I'd much rather I'd count me in the category of trying to persuade donors to think differently beyond perpetuity, as opposed to mandating or controlling or creating a legal obligation.
Heather, any thoughts?
Sure. First, for those who are interested, there's very good analysis of the bill that's available at philanthropyroundtable.org. The second thought is, when I asked what problems are they trying to solve, nobody really has defined what the problem is that's being, with the DAFs that they're trying to solve here. Mm-hmm. And it's bizarre. It actually strikes me as being quite elitist. They're leaving the big foundations and the big money that can afford to have their own private foundation. They're not giving away very much money, and they're just niggling at that. But they're trying to kill the little guys who don't want to go through the expense of having a big foundation and are just using this vehicle. I'm with Dick. I'm for the democratizing of charity. DAFs are a great way for people who don't have a huge amount of money to be charitable. They are already being more charitable than the big foundations are as a percentage of assets and the time with which they give it out. It is a bad solution in search of a problem.
The Husak article will be in the chat. I'd like to bring.
If you can post the Philanthropy Roundtable commentary on the legislation too, which I think is available on their website, that's interesting and people might want to have access to it.
Okay, I empower my behind the scenes colleagues to see if they can dig that up. I'm going to come to John about his experience, ongoing experience now. But when John's finished, Dick and Heather, if you have any thoughts as to what might be a legitimate reason, or what you hear are people have not crazy reasons, or actually legitimate for not sunsetting a foundation, if you think such is out there. John, tell us about the Apgar Foundation, if you don't mind. First of all, tell us the name and tell us about the woman our great friend who was behind it.
The Apgar Foundation is a small foundation started by the late great Martha Apgar, who was married to a guy who ran a bunch of tire stores in New Jersey and did very well. And she started a small foundation a number of years ago to support great books programs, Western civilization courses, and that sort of thing on college campuses. She was worried about the political drift in these places and thought there have got to be some professors and some scholars who could use a little bit of support to help them advocate for the things that we think all of our children ought to be taught, but aren't being taught too often there. So she started this foundation, and I was honored to be invited onto the board a number of years ago. And it's not a large foundation. It has several millions of dollars to give away. And all along, we've understood that upon Martha's death, which happened last year, the clock would start ticking. For years, she just wrote an annual check to the foundation to cover the expenses, to cover the grants that we were deciding to give. And we had a budget we worked with. But upon her death, some money went into the foundation, and now there's a clock ticking, and we have to give it away within a handful of years. And so we're starting to do that. We're starting to do that now. And what's it's only a few years. It's the John M. Olin Foundation. He said within a generation. Martha gave us a lot less time. One advantage of that is that everybody on the board knew Martha. There are some there's a family element on the board, but the rules of the board say actually non-family members have to outnumber family members, and we can have conversations where we ask ourselves, what would Martha do? And we actually do that all the time. But the bottom line is we have to give away this money, and we're gonna do it and meet that deadline.
John, do you feel that the confines of, let's say it's 3 years, I'm not sure exactly, but is that weirdly liberating? Like, this is a mission that can be accomplished.
Yeah, it's entirely doable. Now it depends on the size of the corpus and how long the foundation's been around and does it know what it's doing. There are all kinds of factors involved. And one of the challenges the John M. Olin Foundation faced is that it was doing so well in the stock market that it couldn't wind down as quickly as it wanted to. And the staff members, it's not hard to it's not hard to give away money. It's really easy to give it away poorly, in fact. And the people at the Olin Foundation thought, we actually need a few more years to do this properly. And so it took them a little longer than what they had initially thought. And that was just a result of the market of their stock performance and so forth. In terms of the Apgar, it's entirely achievable, partly because we have a sense of what we're doing and it's not an enormous amount of money, but there are a lot of factors.
So John, I want to go back to what I cut you off earlier, that I wrote, my note up here says that John M. Olin dodged a bullet. I happen to have been fortunate. I was out at Philanthropy Roundtable conference, and Heather and Dick were there, but sat in on a panel about there's a famous case. I think it's Moritz is a donor to Ohio State University, and long story short is the lack of specificity in grants is a cause, or donations is a cause for a lot of chaos we see and upset. Actually, Mike Joyce wrote, and I don't have it in front of me, but one of the things he brought up in his essay was a real lack of specificity from founders and setting up guidelines, et cetera, is only leads to troubles for foundations. Now, John M. Olin, as you wrote, was shocked by what happened to Henry Ford. He, as you said, commanded his trustees to shut the foundation down. But as you also wrote, he never put it in writing, did he?
Not the sunset provision. And he made everybody know that he wanted his foundation to sunset, and he was blessed by a great and loyal staff, and also a board of trustees that adhered to his donor intent. They followed it. This is not necessarily a universal experience. And we opened your question with me, and I was talking about the Ford Foundation. To a certain extent, this is Henry Ford's own fault. He never wrote down anything either about its purposes. He just, said, go do good, basically. And what that meant evolved over time according to who wound up on that board, and until it became something very different from what he started out as. So Olin never wrote down this command. His board abided by it, though, which is, he was fortunate in that regard.
Heather, could you tell us a little about the Randolph Foundation? Give us the full name, give us the roots and the purpose and the perpetuity, or the lack of there such.
The Randolph Foundation is the full name. It was created in 2003 as a result of a settlement in a lawsuit, replacing what had been the H. Smith Richardson Charitable Trust, which went back to the vastly larger control of the vastly larger Smith Richardson Foundation. And so when creating a new incorporated entity, we put in it ends in 2035 with the option of the trustees to extend it, but no further than 2075. So the idea was it would expire within the lives of people who knew the intentions behind it. And it supports, within a broad philosophical sense, it supports those ideas that are essential to the functioning and flourishing of freedom, liberty, constitutional government. But it does it because unlike Dick's Foundation, it's really tiny. So in order to maximize the use of the dollars, it provides almost no general operating support to larger, ongoing, successful projects and institutions. It focuses the vast majority of its giving on startups and projects within existing institutions that otherwise might not get funding. They're not very appealing to donors, or they're a little bit risky, or whatever the case might be. But we see ourselves as essentially venture funders who move to support things that are important. And if we are successful, then eventually other donors will want to come in and back them.
Do you see any legitimate reason for a philanthropy to not have a sunsetting provision? Heather, to you, and then Dick on that same question.
I would go back to common law. If you've got I defer to the wisdom of the ages, and what they came down to, having looked at where perpetual institutions could grow and become really problematic for societies, was they said that if you've got a specific purpose with specific accountability for those purposes, then you can keep going. But if it's just because you feel like holding on to the money because you think you're going to be better at it, and whoever's running it 100 years from now is going to be better at it than spending the money now, there's a greater public interest in getting those charitable resources spent sooner rather than later if you really think that there are problems to address. So no, I don't think that outside of the common law exceptions, there are good reasons for perpetuity.
Dick,
Other than vanity.
That's okay. Dick, any thoughts on that?
Great answer, Heather. Great answer. I would agree, and but from a legal standpoint, but we're talking about advising folks, and my counsel would be the same thing that I think Heather, you referenced as well, that there's in almost every language in the world there's a reference to the third generation, from shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And so I would encourage folks, as a matter of wisdom, to focus the giving around those who truly understood the intention of the donor, the intention of the originator, the founder, to move the funds toward those purposes. Beyond that, it's very, very hard, seems to me, to define a purpose so precisely in today's world that it's going to stay on focus.
So we have just a few minutes left, and I'm curious about. I want to maybe get you in trouble with your children and grandchildren, but this has to do with advising, and maybe if not from your own experience, from your wisdom of seeing how other foundations are run. Is blood? Is family better? Are you better served? Is a philanthropy better served by being run by family than by, quote unquote, we'll call them outsiders? Is there a case to be made one way or the other? Or maybe there is no case at all?
I think it absolutely depends on who the family is. So some people don't have family. Other people have family, but the family are goofy and don't share the interests of the testator. And so it really is a function of knowing who shares. This presumes that the donor actually has a point of view and cares where the money is going, right? But if they do, and they want it to adhere to those purposes, then their single best insurance policy is that it is given away within the lifetimes of people who knew them well and are going to honor that knowledge of what their intentions were. And you get beyond that, just think about your own lives. How obligated do you feel to, somebody who died 50 years before you were ever born? I mean, some of us would, who have, fiduciary training, but a lot of other people don't. So family does have the advantage of they feel potentially some kinship to the donor. And this is not a profession for them. One of the things I go into in the article, which you have kindly linked, is the professional pull on professional staff to get the next job, to fit into whatever the consensus view is there, not necessarily what the donor would have wanted, and also the incentive to keep things going rather than having to look for another job. So I do think that there are probably advantages to the family, but it really depends on who that family is.
Dick?
I would go a little bit further. I think there are advantages to the family if it's the right family. Now, that being said, one of my credos is that every family is dysfunctional, just all in different ways. So there's no perfect family, and it's not about family, but about philosophical alignment or alignment with the true intentions of the donor. My tendency is to find a blend about family, non-family. What I've found with boards that I've constructed and other organizations is that if you have families sitting around, oftentimes it can devolve into childhood, and that siblings can start to behave badly. And so you want to, but that's okay. They're still family. They do understand their parents, and they understand the situation potentially, and in a unique way. So I think a blend personally of family along with trusted advisors who knew the donor well would be an optimal combination at least in my personal opinion.
Well, we have 2 minutes left, so let me just end this by a very blunt and basic question. We're all in an elevator together, and there's a guy there who sees you all and asks you all for advice on. He's just starting a foundation. He won the lottery. He won the New York lottery, and he wants to start a foundation. John Miller, he's curious about sunsetting. He needs a quick opinion from you. Yes or no?
I say do it, because you can direct the giving, you can enjoy being a philanthropist, you can have a greater impact on your own time, and that the future will take care of itself.
Heather?
I obviously argue strongly in favor of sunsetting. And I very often, when I've been asked about this, I encourage setting up multiple different organizations, or trusts, so that if part of your desire is to have your children have something that they can use to allocate resources to the causes and charities that they care about, set up something where it is just distributed on a per capita basis, not too differently actually from what the Devoses did, by letting the individual kids have their own foundations to give to their interests, rather than forcing everybody to be together or diverting from mission. If you've got a foundation that's, say, a public policy foundation, or it has a particular mission, make sure that that's what the money goes to. And if you have another purpose for the money, set up a separate entity to do that other purpose.
Dick, you got 10 seconds.
Sound legal advice. If giving is a joy, then enjoy it in your lifetime. Why not? Celebrate it, enjoy it, be a part of your community, and give generously.
I appreciate that. I have one pitch to make, and if folks have to leave, they have to leave, but I really do appreciate the three of you being here today and sharing your wisdom. I think this has been very illuminating, and it'll probably be very helpful to any number of folks in the philanthropic world. I wanted to let people know that the Center for Civil Society is having a conference in Scottsdale on November 17th. In the chat, you'll find a link. It's about restoring American community, and we're here to strengthen civil society at American Philanthropic. So please consider attending. Again, Dick, Heather, John, thanks so much. You were terrific. And we will be back again soon. I think in December, we'll have another webinar on probably the religious roots of charity. I'll have to read the Bible first before I can lead that webinar. But thanks so much. And thanks everyone who participated and attended. Greatly appreciate it. Have a good day.